Joseph no longer had a cell phone. His girlfriend, Nikki, discontinued his service when she moved out of their apartment just days earlier. Now Joseph sat in the passenger seat as we drove from Brooklyn to Atlanta. We were a band named The Wait on our way to record a record. 6 of us heading south in a borrowed van. We asked Joseph, our singer, if he was single now, and he said he didn't know for sure. How could he know? He explained. He had no phone with which to ask. Pockets' girlfriend, on the other hand, had given him an ultimatum. Either he find a real job or she would kick him out of their apartment. Pockets is one of the greatest musicians I've ever known, so in our band, he played the most difficult instrument, the pedal steel. Of course, none of us made our living as musicians. We all worked day jobs to pay our rent. But Pockets' girlfriend wasn't impressed with his day job or his musicianship. No, she stood firm. He must find a real job or he wasn't living with her any longer. And this was a little concerning to the rest of us. Pockets made his money as a bartender, just like everyone else in the band. If he didn't have a real job, what were the rest of us doing? Jameson, our keyboardist, had been divorced for longer than I'd known him. In fact, Joseph and Nikki now lived in the apartment which Jameson once shared with his wife during their married years. Decorations Jameson's ex-wife had purchased still hung on the walls. Stickers of flowers adorned the bathroom mirror, each one adhered by a woman that I had never met. Later, I would also live in this apartment, and later still, Pockets would join me when his girlfriend finally kicked him out, just like she said she would. I guess it was a home built for failed relationships. At this time, I was 28 years old and recently single myself. I'd had a girlfriend for 5 months, the longest relationship of my life, but I'd grown restless. Before we started dating, I'd spent half a decade going out every night of the week to some bar or club or concert. And after we broke up, I would waste another 5 years doing the same thing. I just couldn't settle down. I'd like to say that I had explained this to my girlfriend compassionately, that I had broken it off with honor. But this is rarely the case with a restless man. Instead, I'd behaved like an asshole and waited for her to break up with me, which she did. Now I was just happy to be single, playing lead guitar in this band, and on my way to Atlanta to record my first real record in a real recording studio. Tommy, our drummer, sat next to me in the rear of the van, slumped in his seat. Tommy had it worse than anyone. The love of his life, Linda, had left him 11 months earlier, and he didn't know what to do. The two of them had moved to Brooklyn together, and they had a number of happy years. I met them as a couple, and I'll tell you, Tommy was in love. He never flirted with another woman, never questioned their relationship. Tommy spoke of Linda like a saint who had saved his life, like he was the luckiest person to have her. But then his drinking got away from him. Tommy was relatively handsome, tall with tattoos and a good head of hair. But what he lacked was confidence. Tommy assumed no one wanted him around unless he was told otherwise. Whenever he presented an idea, he always buffered it with the words, "This is probably a dumb idea, but..." Of course, alcohol is the perfect temporary solution for all of these worries. Tommy might have been fine, but his life kept getting more social, and the more he interacted with people, the more he drank. Before moving to New York, Tommy worked at a cemetery, a mostly solitary job. But upon arriving in Brooklyn, he found himself drumming for 2 bands, playing shows regularly, and, most recently, managing a bar named Lulu's. This was the bar that employed the members of our band. "It's going to be good times tonight," shouted Joseph from the front of the van. "Everyone's coming out to the bar when we pull into town." Joseph was from Atlanta. It was his idea to record our record there. "Marlowe and Tom Cheshire are coming," Joseph went on. "How are you going to call them?" asked Pockets. "Don't worry about it," said Joseph. "They already know." Joseph reached forward and turned down the stereo. He twisted in his seat and faced us. "Shannon's coming out tonight," he said. "She's going to pick one of you guys to go home with her. Mark my words. I've seen her do it before." Joseph pointed at Tommy and said, "Shannon loves musicians." Tommy slunk deeper into his seat. Maybe we should have accepted that Tommy had a problem when we started receiving calls from other bars. "Come get your manager," said a voice on the other end of the phone. "He's passed out in one of our booths. He can't sleep here." Tommy was not built for management. Telling other people what to do, this was his nightmare. It made him overwhelmingly uncomfortable, and this discomfort led to more drinking. "Linda found me passed out on the couch this morning," Tommy told me one afternoon at Lulu's. "I'd pissed all over the living room door. I don't even remember doing it. I didn't know what to do. She was furious. So, unfortunately, I blamed it on the dog." Tommy shook his head. "I don't think she even believed me. But then I had to put the dog's nose in my fucking piss and yell at him. I felt terrible." Tommy couldn't look at me. He spoke to the floor. "After Linda went to work, I gave the dog like an entire bag of treats. I just kept petting him and apologizing for hours." Pockets pulled the van into a gas station. Everyone got out to stretch their legs. Tommy went into the convenience store and came out with a honey bun. "Oh," Joseph said, pointing his cigarette at Tommy. "Shannon's vegetarian as well, so you guys got that in common." Tommy nodded and slunk back into the van. Since his breakup, we'd all been looking out for Tommy, trying to get him to laugh, trying to get him out of his shell, trying to get him laid, which was truly the last thing on his mind. As you can probably guess, his drinking got worse. He was gaining weight, sleeping at the bar, pissing in other weird places. This is where he really needed our help. But this is also where we were useless, because we all drank too much. Alcohol was everyone's problem. It was why Pockets' girlfriend didn't want him working at the bar. It was why Joseph's girlfriend had turned off his phone. And it was even responsible for my drive to go out 7 nights a week. In fact, as the van pulled into Atlanta, we were all drinking beer. We were drinking beer in the van on our way to a bar to drink more beer. Well, Joseph was right. Shannon cornered Tommy in a booth immediately. We looked on with fear and excitement, although it seemed to be going well. Shannon said something, Tommy nodded. Shannon said something else, Tommy covered his mouth and laughed. Honestly, I felt a little jealous that Shannon had not picked me. The whole band was busy, though. We had toured quite a bit. We'd played Atlanta 4 or 5 times, and on each visit, we'd become closer with the people Joseph introduced us to. Truth be told, my Atlanta connection did not start and end with Joseph. During these years, Atlanta had a decent-sized rock and roll scene, and these musicians enjoyed an ongoing exchange with Brooklyn. Garage rock and power pop bands moved back and forth between the two, doing tours, playing small festivals, or even relocating their band entirely. In fact, Joseph had started the wait in Atlanta years before arriving in New York. "You're not having this in Brooklyn?" asked some Atlanta guy while buying me a shot. "Seriously, the crime here right now is fucking crazy." It was January of 2009. We'd specifically planned our recording session so we could escape New York's harsh winter. But this winter was a little different than most. Over the past few months, the United States saw bank failure after bank failure. The financial crisis, they were calling it. The Great Recession. "I don't know," I said. "Everyone told us it was going to be bad, but New York seems the same. I mean, none of my friends have lost their jobs, but I only know bartenders. People are still drinking." "You're lucky," said the Atlantan. "I hear about someone getting robbed every day." We cheersed our shot glasses and drank. As the night went on, our band conjugated in a large booth. It was all of us, as well as Shannon, who remained glued to Tommy. "We should get out of here," said Joseph. "We're loaded into the studio at 9 a.m. "Don't go," pleaded Shannon. She grabbed Tommy's arm. Shannon kind of looked like Tommy. They were both tall and tattooed. She might have also been Irish, like him, but it was hard to tell because her hair was dyed black. Shannon thought for a moment and then said, "You guys should come to my apartment. I've got half an ounce of weed." And this got Tommy's attention. Okay, suddenly I'm realizing I'm getting this whole story wrong. I mean, life's a jumble, particularly these years. Yes, there was Tommy's breakup, followed by a period of heavy drinking. But now I remember that January of 2009 was actually a positive time for Tom. He'd already hit some kind of bottom and decided to quit drinking on his own, without our help, in spite of our bad influence, honestly. He had put down the bottle and said it was all marijuana from here on out. My guess is that Shannon was already aware of this, so her invitation was not accidental. She knew what she was doing. Soon, the members of our band were climbing into the van and wishing Tommy farewell. "You know where the studio is, right?" Joseph asked Shannon. "I'll have him there bright and early," Shannon replied. We were crashing at our usual spot, staying with Joseph's close friend, Gentleman Jesse. "Come on in," said Jesse, standing in his doorway. He wore his pajamas. He had clearly just woken up. We passed him with our suitcases and guitars. "Honestly, I'd bring your amps in as well," said Jesse. "I know it's a pain in the ass, but break-ins are insane right now." "Someone mentioned that at the bar," I said. "Yeah, it's really bad." Our band discussed bringing in the equipment, but we were too tired from the drive and too drunk from the bar, so we decided to risk it. "Sorry I couldn't make it out tonight," said Jesse. "I got work in the morning, but I'm free most of the week." We thanked Jesse, and he shuffled his way back to bed. There were only 3 couches in Jesse's house, no extra beds, so Joseph and I were left to sleep on the hardwood floor. "We're gonna need another hand over here," yelled Jameson from the driveway of the studio. He and Pockets were trying to remove our 250-pound Hammond M3 organ from the back of the van. Ed Rawls, the producer of our record, stood in his doorway watching them struggle. Ed stopped me as I rushed out the door to help. "You might want to not yell so much," he told me, "and get this stuff inside as soon as possible." Ed looked to his left and to his right. "My neighbors have always been super cool, but I'm hearing about a lot of robberies right now. Let's not bring too much attention." I nodded, but there was only so much I could do. The organ weighed twice as much as I did. We made quite a scene getting it through Ed's front door. Ed's studio was built in a 100-year-old house on Atlanta's west side. The house had soundproofing in some windows, but not in others. Basically, it looked like the house I grew up in. Cozy but drafty, collapsing in on itself. None of the doorways were at right angles. All of the floors sloped one direction or another. The walls could have used a paint job. When we arrived, we found Tommy sitting on a couch, drinking coffee. "There he is," exclaimed Joseph while setting down a couple of guitars. "What'd you do last night?" Of course, Tommy didn't say anything. He was embarrassed, like usual. So, naturally, we tried to make that worse. "He finally popped his cherry," I said. "This guy's the quiet killer," added someone else. Tommy again smiled while covering his mouth. He was born with bad enamel. Some of his teeth were just nubs, so this was his natural response. "You gonna grab your drums out of the van, or what?" asked Jameson eventually. Tommy jumped out of his seat. We set up the drums in the living room, surrounded by our guitars and guitar pedals. Cables stretched out from our pedal boards and connected to amps that were scattered throughout other rooms of the house. This would keep the sound of the guitars from bleeding too heavily into the drum mics. "Here," said Ed. "Let me get this thing going." He walked to the side of the room and turned some knobs on a large white metal box. Flames burst from its front. "Watch yourself with this guy," said Ed, pointing at the heater. "Don't kick this tube. I got gas being pumped in from the kitchen. It's dangerous, but it gets the job done." We stopped what we were doing and watched the flames churn. "We can't run it too long," said Ed, "'cause it doesn't have a vent. If anyone starts feeling lightheaded, let me know." This was an issue that I'd not taken into account when planning my January in the South. While Atlanta was considerably warmer than New York City, no building here seemed prepared for the 35-degree nights or even the 55-degree days. Heaters were minimal, and insulation seemed non-existent. Everywhere you went, you were freezing. "Should warm up in here in a minute," said Ed. He then walked into the control booth, which had probably once been the dining room of this house. "Fletcher, get in here!" yelled Joseph from the kitchen. I found Pockets, Joseph, and Tommy standing near the sink. Joseph motioned at Tommy and said, "Tell him what her name is." Tommy's head was low. He looked at my chest. "Sandy?" he said as a question. Joseph and Pockets buckled over laughing. When their laughter subsided, Joseph said, "Tommy doesn't know the name of the woman he slept with last night." "Samantha?" Tommy said as another option. Pockets and Joseph laughed even harder. "If I get it right, you're going to tell me I'm right, right?" questioned Tommy. "Maybe," said Pockets, "but you are way off." As Tommy rattled off a few more names, you could hear genuine fear creep into his voice. "Salmon," Tommy said eventually. "Salmon?" we repeated back. Now I was laughing, and Pockets and Joseph were screaming. "What? It's salmon?" Tommy asked with a shocked expression on his face. For some reason, the harder we laughed, the closer he believed he had come to the correct name. "Sophie," Tommy said next, as tears ran down our faces. "Stofie?" Tommy tried after that. Pockets was now hunched over, his face in the sink. "Stofie?" Pockets screamed. "Whose name's Stofie? Yes, it is definitely Stofie." "It's Stofie?" repeated Tommy with a puzzled tone. It's Stofy, we all agreed. It's definitely Stofy. We spent the next 10 hours getting our musical equipment set up and the drum tones dialed in. Then we were off to a bar named Astoria in Cabbagetown. Is Stofy coming out tonight? We taunted Tommy on the drive over, and sure enough, she was there when we arrived. As Stofy approached us, I whispered under my breath, "Hi, Stofy," just loud enough to be heard by the other boys in the band. We looked at each other and smiled, although we would never say this to her face. We liked Stofy. We liked her for Tommy, so we had no intention of making her uncomfortable. Each of us gave Stofy a hug, and then we sat down at a table. The bar was large but pretty empty. The bartender knew Joseph, so eventually he came out from behind the bar and sat down next to us. "Pretty dead tonight," Joseph said to the bartender. "It has been so dead lately," the bartender said. "Everyone's afraid to leave their apartment. I'm definitely not making rent this month." "Well, I can put you on the list for the show on Saturday," Joseph offered. Ed Rawls had us recording Monday through Friday for the next 2 weeks, but Ed didn't work on the weekends. Knowing this, we booked a show on Saturday night, figuring we should play for our friends while we were in town. "Oh, cool," said the bartender. "Yeah, I'll send you a text if I can make it." Joseph nodded, although everyone in our band knew that there was no way for him to receive that text. We sat around for the next couple of hours, and a few more patrons arrived. Joseph recognized a couple of them and told them about the show. Around 1 a.m., we decided to call it a night. We had already paid our tab and put on our jackets when a man suddenly burst through the front door and careened through the bar. He did a couple of zigzags, looking unclear on where he was heading, and eventually zeroed in on the bartender and rushed to the bar. "Hey," he said, slamming his hands down on the bar top, making a huge noise. "Call the cops. I just got robbed in the fucking parking lot. They got my wallet and my phone." The members of the wait stopped and looked at each other. We sat back down. 20 minutes later, the bartender had introduced us to a woman named Meredith. "Okay," said the bartender. "You guys are walking Meredith and Shannon to their cars." He pointed at the two women. "No one's going outside alone," the bartender shouted so everyone could hear. Now, Pockets, Joseph, and I knew that the bartender had just uttered Stofy's real name, but we didn't know if Tommy had picked up on this. Without intending to, we all turned and faced Tommy, who immediately grew uncomfortable with this attention. "What?" he asked, peering around to see what he was missing. It took him a moment, but eventually the name dawned on him, and you could see a wave of relief wash over Tommy's body. 3 minutes later, we hurried through the parking lot. Meredith hopped in a truck, while Tommy again climbed into Stofy's car. As they pulled away, we slammed the door of our van and sped out of the lot, taking a left and making our way back to Gentleman Jesse's house. "You had the couch last night," I pleaded with Jameson as he laid down a blanket. "Yeah," said Jameson. "I'm also 8 years older than you." And, like that, I was again sleeping on the hardwood floor. On day 2 in the studio, we focused on the rhythm section, trying to get a good take of the bass and drums for each song. We played the songs together as a full band, making sure we got the feel right, but we intended to re-record most of the instruments later. Still, if the rhythm guitar fit competently with the bass and drums, we kept that for the final recording as well. This entire recording session was being funded by our friend Bryce, our band's manager in some capacity. When Bryce's father died some years back, Bryce inherited a house which he then sold for a fair sum of money. Since then, most of this money seemed to go to bar tabs. "Fletcher, you getting another drink?" Bryce would ask whenever we were at the bar together. "Just put it on my tab," he'd say. You might be surprised how much money you can go through saying this to all of your friends in New York City. Well, it was at one of these Bryce-funded drinking sessions that he proposed his position as manager of our band. He had a little experience. He had worked at a stoner metal record label, which didn't particularly mean a lot for our country rock sound. But we saw no reason not to try it. If nothing else, it meant a lot more free beer for us. At that time, we already had a record recorded, and we were looking for a label to put it out. "I know people," said Bryce. "This won't be a problem." But months later, he gathered us at a bar for a meeting. "The record industry is bad right now," Bryce said. "Everyone's downloading everything for free. No one knows what to do." We sat at a brunch spot at 11 a.m., drinking shots and beers. Bryce went on. "What would you say if I put the record out?" With these words, Bryce found another way to waste his money. Bryce named his label Colonel Records and began releasing albums by a few local bands, although none of them did much. Our record came out and faded away, and no one noticed. Then another year went by, and we worked up a new batch of songs. "We're going to do this one right," Bryce said. "I'm getting you guys in a real studio, and then we'll get the album put out on a big label." Joseph suggested that we head down to Atlanta, and Bryce gave Ed Rawls $10,000 to make something special. "Karaoke night," said Joseph, putting away his guitar. "Karaoke night," I repeated back. We said goodnight to Ed, climbed in the van, and shouted, "Karaoke night," one last time as we pulled out of Ed's driveway. Soon we were ordering drinks in a bar while a terrible sound blasted through the speakers. The bartender put 5 Budweisers in front of us, and as she opened them, a woman in her late 50s approached me, wearing nothing but yellow thong underwear. "Hey," she said, lightly brushing my arm with her bare breast. "You boys in a band?" I told her we were, and she laughed. "I knew it," she said, then turned and walked away. I stood and watched this mostly naked woman navigate the bar. She was maybe 5'5", but a few inches taller in a pair of heels. Her breasts hung midway down her belly, where they rested on her large stomach. She walked with confidence, stopping to say a few words to a group of men. The men leaned in and listened to this woman. After a moment, they all leaned back and laughed. The woman lightly slapped one of the men on the back and then continued on her way. "This is awful," said Jameson. He motioned around the room and shook his head. "I've never heard someone do such a bad Ozzy Osbourne impression." The terrible sound emitting from the speakers continued. This might not have been so jarring, but another thong-clad woman, also in her late 50s, stood on the stage behind the bartender, strutting around to this off-key singing. Joseph doled out the beers and some strange energy drink for Tommy, and we all cheersed with the words, "Karaoke night." This was the Claremont Lounge, Atlanta's oldest strip club and a staple of our rock and roll community. People smoked cigarettes inside. Construction workers sat at the bar next to artists we knew. The room was small for Atlanta strip club standards. It was built in the basement of a hotel that was about to be shut down by the city for numerous health code violations. Upon entering the Claremont, you found a U-shaped bar to the right, curving around a small stage, and to the left, 2 areas raised maybe 8 inches above the rest of the floor and sectioned off by simple railings. The ground was carpeted, but most of the threads had been worn away over the years. I had been to the Claremont once on my birthday, some years earlier, and these same bandmates bought me 3 consecutive lap dances. They pulled one large, middle-aged woman off of me, mid-dance, to replace her with an older, larger woman. And then they replaced that woman with yet another one before the first song was even through. "This is crazy," I said, pointing to the corner of the room. The bad Ozzy impersonator was handing the microphone to Blondie, a dancer who had worked at the Claremont since before I was born. Blondie fluffed her blonde wig, adjusted her bra to wrangle her huge tits, and began singing Beast of Burden. As the first verse got going, a younger woman took the stage behind the bar in a white nurse's uniform. She was covered in tattoos. I turned to Carlos, an Atlantan friend who stood beside me, and said, "I have never, ever in my life seen a stripper dance to someone singing karaoke. Who thought this was a good idea?" "No one was coming in after the recession," Carlos said. "They had to do something to get people in here." I looked around, and it was true. This was the most crowded bar I had seen since our arrival in Atlanta. Carlos leaned in and said, "It's good. I even came here last week with my dad." And this was true. The Claremont was the kind of place you could go with a family member. Couples stopped in on dates. People drank beer here just because the beer prices were reasonable. It's incorrect to say that the Claremont Lounge was not sexual, but the sexuality was comfortable and fun. Plus, the strippers liked me and my friends because we didn't fit into normal society any more than they did. Us, with our crazy haircuts, tattoos, and piercings, and them, mostly naked at an age that many found unacceptable. Blondie finished her song, and we all clapped and cheered. A few beers later, Blondie had joined us in a corner not far from the karaoke mic. We had cocaine, which she appreciated. "Fuck, I've got to run back to the local," said Jameson, speaking of the bar we had stopped in before arriving at the Claremont that evening. "I left my credit card over there." Jameson held his wallet in his hands. Blondie looked at Jameson and said, "Honey, I hope you're not walking over there now." "I'm just going to run over real quick," said Jameson. The bar was just across the street. "Not this late, you're not," said Blondie. "You're going to get your ass robbed." Around 1 a.m., 5 of us piled into the van. Stofie had come by earlier and picked up Tommy. Before we left, we invited Blondie to our show, but she waved us off. "Some of us got to work on Saturdays," she told us. Now Pockets was behind the wheel, about to turn the key, when he looked up with a start. He peered down at his phone, which was vibrating in a cup holder. He looked back at Joseph, then looked down at his phone again. "Nikki is calling me," he said. This was the first contact we had had from Joseph's girlfriend. It was late, we were drunk. Who knew what state she was in? "Well, I'm not talking to her," said Joseph. We all sat in the van, silently staring at Pockets' phone until the vibrating stopped. Back at Gentleman Jesse's house, I stood in the kitchen brushing my teeth. Jameson walked up behind me and casually said, "I'll take the floor tonight, buddy." I stopped brushing, gave him a hug, then turned and spit in the sink. We were back in the studio, listening to playback of the bass and drums, when Jameson entered from the front porch holding his phone. "I got us a hotel room," he said triumphantly. Then, with a sheepish nod, he added, "Or at least my parents did." Jameson, like Joseph, was from Atlanta, but being some years older than the rest of us, his circle of friends did not fully overlap with Joseph's. "We got it all the way through next week," Jameson went on. "It's got 2 double beds, a fold-out couch, and they can bring up a cot if we need it." We looked at each other and made a show of appreciation, a few light claps. Jameson put his hands on his hips and twisted to the left and right. "I don't think my back could make it another night on that floor," he said. After our day of recording, we stopped at the local for a few drinks and then went downtown to check out our new hotel. "Wow," we said, entering the room. "Look at this place." There was all the furniture Jameson mentioned, plus a TV, a small dining table, a huge bathroom, and a large closet running half the length of one wall. Jameson grabbed a bed, and the rest of us picked spots here and there. Of course, Tommy was already at Stofie's apartment. We had smoked a joint in the bathroom and were getting ready for bed when Pockets got our attention from the couch. "She's calling again," he said, holding his phone in the air. We stood completely still one more time as the phone buzzed and buzzed. When the ringing stopped, we continued what we were doing. "Joe, she left a message," Pockets said, looking at his phone as if it was something evil. Joseph picked a pillow off one of the beds, grabbed his sleeping bag, and opened the door to the large closet. "I'm sleeping in here," he said, entering the closet and shutting the door behind him. The rest of the week went by with more of the same, recording during the day, hitting a bar or two at night. "Thank God you guys always come by, or there'd be no one here," a bartender told us on Thursday. But we were starting to get more nervous. One night, some bar customer returned from their car to tell us that their window had been smashed and a jacket had been stolen. Another night, someone Joseph knew was pinned against the wall in the parking lot of the local, and their wallet was snatched. So the 6 of us stuck together, that is, until Stofie picked up Tommy. Then the rest of the band headed back to the hotel. We'd run the shower for a good chunk of time, steaming up the bathroom to cover the smell of the joint we'd smoke. Then Joseph went to sleep in his closet, and Jameson began snoring. "You coming to the show tomorrow?" we asked Ed Rawls on Friday. "I am not," he said. "I have heard these songs a million times, and I am going to watch a movie with my wife." We couldn't argue with that, but Saturday came, and we were excited. Saturday afternoon, we loaded our equipment out of Ed's studio, and then drove our van to El Mir for a lunch of margaritas and burritos. As the server passed our food, he asked, "Is the show at 529 or the Earl?" "We're actually playing at the Highland Inn," Joseph said, while pointing at his drink to indicate that he wanted another margarita. "I didn't know they did shows over there," the server said. "They're just starting to," said Joseph. "I guess they redid the bar?" The server nodded and told us he'd be there. Soon, the winter sun was setting and the temperature began to drop. We drove to the Highland Inn and parked in an alley near the bar entrance. We quickly ushered our instruments inside, while cautiously looking over our shoulder. "Someone's coming," said Jameson, pointing up the alley at an approaching stranger. Pockets ran inside with his amplifier, but the rest of us froze. We watched the stranger walk another 10 feet. We stared at the stranger, and the stranger stared back at us. Eventually, this person stopped climbed into a parked car, and drove away. Once our equipment was inside, we began to loosen up. We had a couple of beers, and then people started arriving. Lots of people. "Hey, Fletcher, how you doing?" Someone I kind of recognized patted me on the back. Men and women piled out of cars and hugged each other in the parking lot. When someone entered the bar, everyone screamed their name. One person after another offered to buy their friends a round of shots. It was as if these people hadn't seen each other in years. "Fletcher, come on," someone grabbed my attention. "We're going to the alley to smoke a bowl." This was the Atlanta that I knew from previous visits. This was the Atlanta that I recognized. When Gentleman Jesse arrived, our whole band crowded around him. "Hey, Jesse," we said, "you having a party tonight?" We asked this because Jesse had thrown a party at his house after every show we'd ever played in Atlanta. Jesse laughed a little, swaying to one side. "Guys, no," he said. Then his face got serious. "Did you hear about Aaron? He had a home invasion 2 days ago. They knocked him out, tied him up." Jesse stared at us intensely. "They stole half of his shit. His wife came home and found him on the floor. He's lucky he didn't end up in the hospital." And with that, I was sent back to the Atlanta of this time. Eventually, the music started. One friend's band was opening for us, and another friend's band was closing the show. We were left with a sweet spot in the middle. As the first band played, I gave Stofie a hug, and she introduced me to her roommate. A little later, I was cornered by a guy who wanted to talk about my guitar for way too long. Eventually, I escaped this conversation by popping into our green room, where I found Big Jake selling cocaine like it was his own personal office. Some things in Atlanta hadn't changed. Our set went well. We certainly knew the songs. In any case, the audience mostly consisted of our friends, and they would have liked our performance even if it was terrible, but it went off without a hitch. "Dude, that sounded killer," said the guitar talk guy as I packed up my pedals. "You gotta tell me about your amp. What is it, a 75? I got off stage and made my way to the bar, where Stofie approached me. "That was great," she said, giving me another hug. "You were so good. What are you up to tonight?" "Thanks," I said. I don't know. Jesse's not having a party." I pointed at the stage where the last band was setting up. "Probably this," I said. "Okay." Stofie put her hands on her hips. "Well, you remember my roommate, right?" I nodded, although I barely paid attention when she introduced us. "She had to go home because she's got work in the morning, but she said you should come over. So, what are you doing now? You want to come over?" I peered around the room, contemplating this strange and sudden offer. I was still dripping sweat from the stage. I tried to picture the roommate, but all I could remember for sure was that she was wearing a jean jacket. Pretty common attire for this Atlanta crowd. "Yeah," I said. "I don't know, maybe." Stofie looked at me intently as I avoided her eyes. I watched people I had partied with once or twice crowd around the bar. These people were closer to acquaintances than friends. I didn't know if they were born in Atlanta or not. I didn't know most of their last names. Still, every time I had played in Atlanta, I had partied with these maniacs until well after the sun rose, and tonight I had planned on doing the same. "I mean, I want to see this last band play," I said, stalling. "So maybe, I don't know." Stofie gave me a confused look. She squinted her eyes and then broke into a smile. "Okay, yeah," she said. "How many other songs do you need to see?" As the final band played, I hovered in the corner of the room telling stories with a few friends. We yelled over the music and laughed and drank. Tommy stood near the back of the audience watching the performance. I contemplated asking him about Stoffi's roommate, but this seemed like something that would make Tommy uncomfortable, so I remained where I was. Maybe I didn't want to know his opinion. When the band finished, we moved the last of our equipment into a back room where we were allowed to store it until Monday. After everything was locked away, I scanned the bar to see if Stoffi was still around. I found her sitting at a table with a couple of friends. Instead of joining her, I walked to the front where the rest of the wait was making plans about what to do next. There was talk of heading back to the local. As we contemplated who was sober enough to drive, the front door of the bar burst open, and our friend Ezra came rushing in with a woman I didn't recognize. Their faces were flush. They were panting. "We just got chased up the street," Ezra said, panic in his voice. "Some guys locked the door. I don't know. I don't even know what it was." Ezra took a step away from us, looking at nothing, bouncing on the balls of his feet, and then he stepped back into our circle. "I had to get my cigarettes from my car," said the woman by his side. She then waved across the room at someone she knew, and this person started rushing towards us. "I walked her to her car," said Ezra, "and some guys were coming up behind us, fast. I don't know what they were doing, but it felt wrong, so we started running." "I lost my shoes," said the woman. "I had heels on, so I left them there." I looked down. The woman stood on the cold floor in bare feet. "Okay," said Stoffi, appearing beside me with Tommy on her arm. "Both of you guys are walking me to my car." I was too drunk to be nervous about meeting Stoffi's roommate on the ride to Stoffi's apartment. As she drove, Stoffi and I cracked jokes and tried to make Tommy uncomfortable. Stoffi understood this part of Tommy's and my friendship. When we arrived at her place, I was surprised to find that Stoffi lived in a loft. I had never seen this in Atlanta. The layout was mostly one large open room, with 2 couches in the middle separating the kitchen from the living room. The bedrooms were built in opposite corners of this space, as far from each other as possible. Stoffi flipped on the lights, and the apartment looked deserted. Nearly 2 hours had passed since our band finished playing, so I wasn't surprised to find her roommate sleeping. Honestly, this entire strange situation felt like an intimidating way to meet someone. So when I realized it was no longer happening, a wave of relief washed over me. "Where's this weed I keep hearing about?" I asked, walking to one of the couches and sitting down. Tommy joined me. He opened a box on a coffee table and began packing a bowl. "Let me see what my roommate's doing," said Stoffi, walking towards one of the bedrooms. "It's fine," I said, waving one arm in the air. "I'll sleep on the couch. It's way better than the cot I've been using at the hotel." "What? No," said Stoffi. "She wanted you to come over." It's fine, I repeated until Stoffi stopped walking. She shrugged, then turned and made her way to the bathroom. She came out a few minutes later, wearing a pair of glasses. "I'm tired," she said to Tommy. "You ready for bed?" Tommy passed me the bowl, stood up, and walked into Stoffi's bedroom. Stoffi stayed where she was and stared at me for a while. She squinted her eyes under her glasses and then asked, You're gonna sleep on the couch? Suddenly, Stofie was in front of me, taking me by the arm. Come here, she said, lightly lifting me. She guided me through the apartment until we arrived at the bedroom beside the kitchen. Go in here, said Stofie. She's waiting for you. Don't be an asshole. And with that, Stofie was gone. The roommate's door was shut, so I opened it slowly. It was dark inside. I did not bother to turn off the lights in the living room. Hello? I said in a whisper. It's Fletcher. No one responded. I entered the room and quietly shut the door behind me. The room was large. The bed was in the far corner. I took a couple of steps toward the bed and then became unsure about the door. Shutting it suddenly seemed presumptive. I tiptoed back across the room, then silently opened the door again, before finally making my way to the bed. Soon, I hovered over Stofie's roommate, wearing my jeans and a flannel shirt. I leaned down and softly shook her shoulder with the tips of my fingers. Hey, I said, it's Fletcher. Shannon told me to come in here. Stofie's roommate then sat up and looked at me with only one eye open. She wore a white t-shirt and had long brown hair that looked black in the dim light. She didn't say a word, but turned her one-eyed glance from me to the open door, then back to me again. In a single motion, she swung the sheets back and popped out of bed. She rushed to the door, slammed it shut, then turned back towards me. She stood by that door for a moment in only a white t-shirt and a pair of underwear. Eventually, she reached down, grabbed the bottom of the shirt, and pulled it over her head, revealing a large pair of breasts. It was pure fantasy, I said. It was Sunday afternoon. All 6 members of the wait were in the van on our way to Atlanta's renowned aquarium. I didn't know anything about her, I went on, so it was all up to my imagination. She was anyone I wanted her to be. I've never experienced anything like that before. Pockets looked at me and said, You shut the door and then opened it back up? I didn't know what to do, I said. I've never been in that situation before. The real question is, Pockets went on, do you know her name? Everyone looked at me. Yeah, I said. But before I could finish, Jameson cut me off. I know what it is, he shouted. It is obviously Stofie 2. And that's how Tommy and I started dating Stofie 1 and Stofie 2. We smoked a joint in the parking lot and then joined the families roaming the halls of the aquarium. I don't remember many fish, but our whole band became fixated on one child, a boy maybe 9 years old named Chino, who was being pushed around the aquarium in a wheelchair. His mom stood behind him, wheeling him past the whales and the sharks and the penguins as this child hung on the edge of his seat. But the part that got us was every time the mom stopped the wheelchair, the boy would get up and start running. He didn't need the wheelchair at all. He'd charge this way and that, climbing things that weren't to be touched and opening doors that weren't to be opened, while his mom screamed, "Get in the chair, Chino! Get in the chair, Chino!" This boy made sense to us. He felt like our son. Come Monday, we were back in the studio. Bass, drums, and rhythm guitar were done. Most of my lead guitar was down on tape, and it was time to record the lead vocals. Joseph was supposed to rest his voice over the weekend, but, of course, he hadn't. Instead, we'd been at Astoria most of Sunday night for a friend's going-away party. "I need something for my throat," said Joseph, pacing around the studio. Ed Rawls had hot water, lemons, tea, and honey, but none of these things would do. "Whiskey's good for your voice, right?" asked Joseph. We all shrugged and nodded. "Pockets, drive me to the liquor store." Joseph and Pockets returned with a bottle of wild turkey. Joseph poured himself a large glass, straight, and we got to work. After Joseph finished the first take of the first song, Ed Rawls hit the talkback button and said, "That sounded great." "Cool," said Joseph, speaking to us from another room through the studio monitors. "Want me to do another one?" Ed Rawls thought about this for a moment. Eventually, he again pushed the button and said, "Why don't you come in here and give that one a listen?" It was a little past 10 a.m. Joseph sat on a couch in the control room with the rest of his bandmates surrounding him, looking at the mixing board. He poured himself some more wild turkey and then passed the bottle around, and we all took a swig. The control room was drafty. Cold air shook the windows. I wore my winter coat, and Joseph had on an oversized knit winter hat that the rest of the band hated. Ed Rawls pushed play on his 24-track tape machine, and we listened to Joseph sing. Ed wrote a fader and put Joseph's voice high in the mix. "Not that loud," said Joseph, and Ed brought the vocals back down. We listened until the song was done, then looked at each other and nodded. Ed shrugged. "Sounds good to me," he said. Joseph stood up, peered around the room, and yelled, "First take!" He then reached his arm out, and I passed him the bottle of wild turkey. Joseph took a swig from the bottle and swirled his hand in the air in a round-em-up type motion. "All right," he said, "pull up the next one." For the next couple of hours, we sat in the control booth listening to Joseph knock out one song after another. He chugged whiskey between takes, and his voice was smooth and confident. We arrived at Ed's studio with 14 songs, and Joseph breezed through every one of them before 3 p.m. When he nailed a song on the first try, we all clapped and shouted, "First take." Later that night, we were back at the local when Sophie walked in the door. "You boys ready to go?" she asked. Tommy and I looked at each other, said goodnight to our bandmates, and piled into Sophie's car. It was time for me to meet this woman I had just slept with. Soon I was back in the loft. Tommy sat on one couch with Sophie 1, and I leaned back on the other couch with Sophie 2. The couches were arranged in an L shape, so we were all basically facing each other, although each couple largely kept to themselves. Sophie 2 held one of my hands between both of hers. She leaned against me as we talked, and then placed her right leg over my left knee. Tommy was in a similar position, interlocked with Sophie 1 in a number of ways. Occasionally, Sophie would kiss Tommy, although it was more of a peck than anything overtly sexual. This was a position I'd been in with other women in the past. I enjoyed laying around and being affectionate, but I'd never done anything like this with someone else in the room. The way things were escalating, it was almost as if these women were in a competition to see who could be the most affectionate. Sophie 1 would start running her hands through Tommy's hair, and then my Sophie would do the same. My Sophie asked for a massage, and soon Tommy was rubbing Sophie 1's feet. The whole thing was a bit odd, and it made me uncomfortable. "Should we pack another bowl?" I asked. Tommy reached into the weed box and set about making this happen. "Let's see what movies you have," I said, removing Sophie 2's leg from my knee and getting off the couch. I placed a stoner comedy in their DVD player, and Tommy and I watched it as the women held us tight. When the movie was done, we all went to our respective beds. "It's clashing with the drums," said Pockets. "The rhythm has to go like this." Pockets stood over Jameson, who was seated at the studio's upright piano. "This is what I've been playing at practice for the last year," said Jameson. Pockets shook his head and said, "Well, maybe Tommy played the drums differently on the recording. In any case, it's not right." I don't know what had happened in the hotel the night before, but these boys were in a mood. Pockets and Jameson were yelling at each other, while Joseph slept behind them on a couch. Earlier, I had asked Joseph if he was feeling all right, and he told me he had a sinus infection. But then again, I'd also seen him polish off most of that bottle of wild turkey the day before. "If you want to do it the way you want to do it, then you should just do it," yelled Jameson. "It's just my only fucking part in this whole fucking song." This was the 10th day of us all living and working in close proximity, and it was beginning to show. Still, Tommy and I had an escape. After the day of recording was done, we were back at Stofy's loft. "I'm heading to bed," said Stofy too. She stood behind me as I sat on the couch. "I've got work early again." "Okay," I said, waving goodnight. "I'm gonna finish the movie." "The same movie we watched yesterday?" she asked. "It's a good movie," I said. Tommy and I sat on individual couches, smoking weed and laughing at the same jokes we laughed at the night before. And this repetition was not uncommon for us. There were movies we put on constantly at the bar. I'd been known to watch the same movie for months on end. But it would be a lie to say that I didn't know what I was doing in this particular situation. Rewatching the same trashy stoner flick was, in part, a way of alienating these women from our space. I wanted it to be clear that I was not looking for a relationship. Now, why, in this situation, did I need to make this distinction? I do not know. This was a woman who was completely removed from my life. Stofy, too, lived nearly 1,000 miles from New York City. There was no way things were getting serious between us. Still, I kept her at a distance, and this seemed, in that moment, to be the right thing to do. If I could go back in time and be more present and sober with every woman I slept with before meeting my wife, I would. But, of course, that is just a daydream. When the movie was over, I packed another bowl. I took a hit, stood up, and crossed the room to the DVD player. I leaned over, scanned the buttons for a moment, and then pushed play, beginning the movie one more time. The following day was Wednesday. This would be our last day of tracking. The rest of the studio time was set aside for Ed to mix the songs. As Tommy and I entered the studio, Pockets looked at us and said, "Last night, after you guys left, Jameson got us kicked out of Star Bar." "We didn't get kicked out," said Jameson. "He got in a fight with the DJ." Jameson dismissed this with a loud scoff. Then Pockets turned to Jameson and said, "You got in her face and told her all the music she was playing was bullshit, and then you wouldn't let up about it for like an hour until we basically dragged you out the door." Jameson shook his head, but I knew Pockets was telling the truth. I guess it's time to mention that Jameson had been on a bit of a tear. Already on this trip, he'd gotten us kicked out of one woman's apartment when she found him, fully clothed, laying under the covers of her bed. Later, Jameson became strangely rude to a girl who was flirting with Joseph at our show. Now this incident with the DJ. I wondered if this had something to do with Jameson returning to his hometown. But then again, Jameson had always been a wild card. This is part of why we liked him. Like I mentioned, Jameson was older than us by most of a decade. But as he aged, he hadn't slowed down. And we found this kind of inspirational. In fact, on the day we asked Jameson to join our band, we saw him casually vomit directly into an empty bottle of Budweiser. He did this without spilling any of the vomit or even disrupting the conversation he was having. Maybe we should have taken this as a warning, but to us, it was one of the most impressive things we had ever witnessed. He showed up to our next practice with his Fender Rhodes. I mean, Jameson started to say, and then he paused. He looked at Pockets, looked away, then looked back again. I mean, the music she was playing was bullshit. Who cares? Shouted Pockets. And then they were at it again. The only thing left to finish on the recording was backing vocals. Ed had the full band circle one microphone. There were some songs we sang in harmony and some we chanted as a group. This should have been a fun part of the recording process, but I was too nervous to enjoy myself. I spent half of the session trying not to stand anywhere near Joseph. What I assumed was a hangover the day before now looked much more sinister. Joseph's eyes were puffy, his nose was dripping. He again drank straight whiskey, but this time, as he sipped, it didn't look like he was having any fun. I, myself, woke that morning in Stofy 2's bed, feeling a bit sick as well. My throat was sore and my head ached. Looking at Joseph was like seeing a future that I hoped to avoid. I tried telling myself it was nothing, just some exhaustion. But I knew better. Ed had already put in a few hours of mixing when we called it a day. Like usual, we stopped by a bar after leaving the studio, but all I could think about while we were there was, where's Stofy? When can she take me away from here? And Stofy did arrive, like the nights before, just after she finished work at 10 p.m. As Tommy and I walked through the parking lot, I didn't look over my shoulder or listen for approaching strangers. I thought of nothing but climbing into the back seat of Stofy's car and closing my eyes. By the time we arrived at the loft, Stofy 2 was already asleep, and this was fine with me. I lay on the couch and, of course, put on the same movie as the 2 previous nights. I fell asleep for a while, but woke before sunrise. After waking, I quietly made my way into Stofy 2's room, curled into the corner of her bed, and passed out for a few more hours. When I woke, Stofy 2 was already gone, and I felt worse than I had the day before. Joseph and I stood in the kitchen of Ed Rawls' studio making tea. Joseph removed the cork from a bottle of Bullet bourbon and poured some in his cup. He held the bottle in my direction, but I shook my head. The rest of the band sat here and there, killing time while Ed mixed the songs. When Ed had a song in a good place, he'd call us into the control room, where he'd hit play and ask us what we thought. But mostly we were all just doing nothing. There was a couch just inside the front door of the studio. I lay across it, again wearing my winter coat. I pulled the hood of the jacket over most of my face and fell asleep. When I woke, Pockets was sitting on the piano bench staring at me. I blinked a couple of times, and he kept his eyes on my face. As I rose to a seated position, Pockets brought his finger to his lips, silently telling me to hush. I was still a little dazed coming out of sleep. I looked around the room and then found a couple more bandmates standing in a doorway looking at me as well. As my ears adjusted to the waking world, I noticed the sound of Joseph's voice was all around me. It was distant, ghostly, both huge and small at the same time. He sang for a minute or so, and then stopped. "How about that?" said Ed, popping out of the doorway. "My reverb tank is right behind you." I looked behind the couch, but didn't see anything but a plywood wall. "It's that whole thing," Ed went on. It's probably as big as your van. My buddy built it. It's really sweet. I looked back again and now understood what Ed was saying. The plywood that I saw did not quite reach the ceiling. Instead, it was creating a little closed-off room where sound echoed around. Inside, these sounds interacted with a large metal plate in such a way that beautiful reverberations were produced. "Okay," said Ed. "We're going to run some backing vocals through it now. Fletcher, don't make any sound while I got this thing going. There's a mic in the reverb tank that it can even pick up talking in this room." With that, Ed Rawls disappeared through the same door he had entered. I felt worse than ever. It hurt to swallow, and my head throbbed with each beat of my heart. In less than 48 hours, we would be driving home, and this brought me joy. All I wanted to do was sleep in my own bed. "Should we do Astoria?" asked Joseph as we said goodnight to Ed and made our way outside. Pockets was in the driveway holding a football that had been kicking around in the van. As I walked down the stairs from Ed's house, Pockets threw me the football, and I caught it surprisingly well. Joseph then jogged out into the street and put one hand in the air, so I sent the ball his way. Ed's house was built on a hill. From the bottom of Ed's stairs, the street sloped to the right. Pockets ran uphill on this street, and Joseph lobbed him the football. "Hey, Fletcher," yelled Pockets as I reached the door of the van. He pointed a finger into the road, and although I was in no mood to do anything physical, I humored him and stepped from the driveway into the street. Pockets had a decent throw, but I missed the catch and it bounced off my hip. The football wobbled across the road before turning with the hill's natural slope. I chased after the ball and caught up with it 20 feet down the hill. "Let's go, Fletcher! Let's go!" I heard Jameson's voice, but could no longer see any of my bandmates. "Go, come on, go, go!" Now it was all of my bandmates yelling in unison. Their voices became more frantic. I heard the van's engine start, and the reverse lights came on instantly. Jameson nearly backed into me while reversing into the street. I jogged beside them with the football and made a motion like I was going to throw it through the van's open sliding door. "What the fuck are you doing?" yelled Joseph, standing up in the van. "Get in!" I grabbed onto the armrest of a bench seat and barely got one foot inside the vehicle before Jameson floored it up the hill. "What the fuck are you doing?" asked Joseph again. He shoved me into my seat. I didn't say anything. I didn't understand what the rush was all about. "Didn't you see that guy?" asked Joseph. He leaned across me and shut the van's door. "Didn't you see the guy with the fucking gun walking up the road?" I didn't understand what he was saying. My head was heavy. The cold outdoor air had caused my nose to run. As Jameson took a right, I looked back onto the street we had just climbed. I looked for a man, but the van was speeding and the road was gone in a flash. I didn't see anyone. Not a soul. For a while, there was a fury of everyone talking at once, each bandmate giving their side of the story, shouting over one another. As the van whined through Atlanta's many streets, this chatter slowed down and eventually turned to silence. I leaned back against my seat and closed my eyes. I tried to feel afraid, but only felt tired. "Fletcher," said Tommy. He sat in the seat directly behind me, tapping me on the shoulder. I turned around. I got a text from Shannon," he said. He stared deeply into his tiny flip phone. "She says her roommate has work in the morning, and she doesn't want you coming over." He closed his phone and lightly put it on the seat next to him. "She says, bye." I turned back around and again pulled the hood of my jacket over my head. Astoria was pretty empty. I sat in a booth drinking water, trying to ease my sore throat. The rest of the band did shots with the bartender and told him about our narrow escape. I had volunteered to be designated driver, and this put everyone in a good mood. Later, they sat with me in my booth, talking about 70s musicians and 90s one-hit wonders. Later still, Jameson wandered off to a table by himself and sat with his back to us. Occasionally, he'd turn and yell something in our direction. I didn't listen to what he was saying. I wasn't listening to anyone. This night at Astoria went on and on. Stofie came for Tommy around 11 p.m. She gave me a wave from the door as Tommy climbed out of our booth. I sipped my water, still wearing my winter coat. I nodded when someone asked me a question. When the boys decided to go back to the hotel, I was more than ready. We walked across the parking lot together, and I climbed in the driver's seat of the van. As I pulled out of the driveway, everyone was drunk, talking loudly. I did my best to ignore them. I don't know where we were when it happened. I had stopped at a traffic light, and we were waiting for it to turn green. There were no buildings around us, no cars on the road. We could have been in the middle of some kind of park, but it looked more like a giant overpass soaring over some enormous highway. Sometimes in Atlanta, it's hard to tell the difference. First, I heard the van's sliding door open, and then everyone started yelling, "Where are you going?" I looked to my right and saw Jameson passing the front of the van, walking through the empty intersection. "Get back in," shouted Joseph. He leaned his head out the van's door. When the light turned green, I pulled beside Jameson and rolled along at the speed he was walking. "What are you doing?" asked Joseph. "We're miles from the hotel." "Go fuck yourself," yelled Jameson. "You can't walk all that way," Joseph continued. "You saw what happened today." This went on for a long time. As the van continued crawling down the road, cold air flooded in through the open door and irritated my already sore throat. Jameson wouldn't look at us. He walked at a steady pace. "We're sorry," said Joseph. "Come on, get in the van. It's fine, let's get some sleep." Eventually, Jameson stopped, so I pressed on the brake. Without saying a word, Jameson climbed through the door. He still wouldn't look at us. "It's all right," said Joseph. "Take a seat." Joseph stood up and gave Jameson the seat closest to the door. At the exact moment that Jameson sat down, Pockets leaned in from the back of the van and yelled, "Get in the chair, Chino!" And with that, Jameson was up, out the door, and back on the side of the road. We spent another couple of minutes speaking to him as he walked silently along. Eventually, I turned to the boys and said, "Look, he knows where he is. He's from here. If he wants to walk, let him walk. I don't care. I'm tired." Everyone looked at each other and nodded. Joseph leaned over and shut the door as I pushed on the gas pedal. If Jameson noticed, he didn't make a show of it. He just kept walking steadily along. When we arrived at the hotel, everyone was quiet. Luckily, Pockets had a key to the room. I wasn't wearing my contact lenses, so I made my way straight to the couch. I didn't even brush my teeth. Pockets was digging something out of his bag when Joseph approached him and asked, "Hey, can I borrow your phone?" We all stopped what we were doing and watched as Joseph dialed and brought the phone to his ear. The phone rang, and then, by the tone of Joseph's voice, we could tell the call had gone to voicemail. Joseph was drunk, standing in the middle of the room, when he began to speak. "Nikki," he said, I just want to say that I miss you and that I love you and that I'm going to sleep in the closet." With that, he threw the phone on the bed, walked into the closet, and shut the door behind him. I don't remember much about our final day in the studio. I spent most of it on the couch. I know Ed Rawls worked late into the night trying to finish the last of our mixes. At some point, we packed up our equipment and rushed it out to the van. Bryce, our manager and financial backer, he was there. I don't know what day he arrived, but I know he was there with us at the end. He got drunk and celebrated our performance, telling us we had created, in his words, a masterpiece. Like our last record, Bryce tried selling these songs to serious record labels with notoriety and a marketing team, and like our last record, no one was interested. A year later, Bryce was back to us with an idea that we had heard before. "I'll just release it myself," he said. He pressed 500 copies, and again, not much came of it. With the record's release, Bryce sent us out on a 7-week U.S. tour. This tour was, unfortunately, booked by someone who had no idea what they were doing. On this tour, if we were lucky, we played to no one. On the other nights, we performed in front of people who hated our music and wanted us off the stage. Our band never fully recovered from this trip. But those were the bad days, and they were still ahead of us, not yet our concern. Here in Atlanta, we were a band that had finished a record that we were proud of. We were a group of friends that fought from time to time, but still hung out every day. We were men climbing into our van and making our way home, making our way back to Brooklyn where it was safe, a statement you don't hear very often. In fact, a lot of things were going to be okay. I told you at the beginning of this story how Pockets became my roommate after his girlfriend threw him out of the house. Threw him out for not having a real job. What I didn't mention is that the two of them stayed together during this time. And later, Pockets proposed. And later still, all of the members of the Wait performed together as his wedding band. Now, as for Joseph, he and Nikki were eventually married as well. The ceremony took place down south, and it had all the members of the Wait standing side by side as Joseph's groomsmen. But this marriage wasn't meant to last. I remember sitting in a bar with Joseph, and this is years after our band broke up. But we were sitting there, drinking liquor to celebrate his recent divorce. Now, Joseph is not one to show his emotions, but I knew that this was a hard time for him. But, again, that's focusing on the bad times. No, let's stay focused on the Wait in 2009. We drove the 14 hours from Atlanta to New York, listening to the songs we had just recorded, excited about what we had done. We asked Tommy if he was going to miss Stofie, and if this meant he was ready to get back in the dating pool. We demanded that Jameson tell us where he went after jumping out of the van, but he never gave us an answer. We pulled into Brooklyn around midnight, and although what Joseph had said on the phone didn't sound like much, there was Nikki waiting for him when he stepped out of the van. She opened the door to their apartment and invited him in. I tried calling Joseph a few days later. I wanted to see if he could cover me at the bar that weekend. Something had come up out of the blue, and I was desperate. I was ready to plead. I scrolled to his name and hit the green button on my flip phone. I didn't even think about it. I brought the phone to my ear and waited for it to ring. Before the phone could even make a sound, Joseph picked up and said, "Hello."
Get in the chair, Chino. Just tell me where you wanna go. Oh, I'll take you there. Get in the chair, Chino. Oh, where you wanna go? I'm gonna go there. Well, I ain't no square. I ain't no square, no. It just feels so good when I go. I take it easy. Feels so good. Time to time, being sleazy. Being sleazy. Oh, no. It's just what I thought it would be.
Okay, so the record we recorded in Atlanta is titled Nowhere Now. Nowhere Now by The Weight. Like, I'm putting on weight. I'll put a link in the show notes if you want to listen on Spotify. I'm still really proud of that record. Like I mentioned, we were a country rock band that found itself basically surrounded by garage rock and power pop bands. That was just the friends we had. So anyway, as a result, Nowhere Now definitely rides the line between these genres. It's a country rock record that sounds like it was made by guys stuck in the power pop scene. It's as much influenced by Jonathan Richman as, like, Neil Young. Take a listen to the album, and if you like it, please tell people to check out this podcast. If you know someone who is dating a girl whose name they don't know, tell them to listen to this episode. Oh wait, here it comes. In all seriousness, please tell one friend about my podcast. This is maybe the most helpful thing you can do for me. Word of mouth is really the best system small artists have to reach a bigger audience. For the love of God, save me from obscurity. What else is there to say about Atlanta? In researching this story, I found that the Claremont is still doing karaoke on Tuesdays. To this day, it's a hit. I guess we were there at the beginning of a tradition. If you've made it this far, listen to every episode from this season, and you have not Venmo'd me $5, now is the time to do it. Artists are out here struggling. The ways to make money are getting smaller, and competition is getting greater. If you had fun listening to my stories this season, please help me out. Send what you can. Any amount is appreciated. But if you support the podcast with $20 or more, I am going to mail you a cool gift. A book of my writing that I made myself. A handmade book. Something physical for you to have. My Venmo is at Fletcher C. Johnson, and my PayPal is fletchercjohnson@gmail.com. And I want to stop to thank all the people who have already sent money this season. You're leading the path so there can be more stories in the future, and I can't thank you enough. I also want to send a big thank you to Zach Gajewski and Will Thunderegg Georgiantis, two friends who helped edit the story that I read on this episode. A big thanks to Aristides and Gus for letting me steal their dads for a time. After that disastrous tour, The Weight went into the studio one last time, and we recorded 2 songs, but we broke up before they were ever released. They were never released. But it was a studio in Brooklyn, and I only mention it because, okay, we had spent the whole day recording the instruments and drinking, obviously. And when it came time to do the vocals, we were like, Joseph, we've got to run to the liquor store and get you another bottle of Wild Turkey so you can again sing like an angel. But folks, let me tell you, the amazing wild turkey trick only works if you're starting mostly sober at the beginning of the day. We ran out at 10 p.m., got a bottle, and after Joseph took a couple of swigs of that thing, he was totally fucked. I've never heard anyone singing so completely off-tempo in my life. It was like he was singing a different song altogether. Anyway, we had to book another day in the studio so he could come back and fix those vocals. So that's it. Thanks to everyone who is listening right now, who made it all the way to the end. A huge thanks to James Ellis for convincing me to do this podcast in the first place. I'll be back one day with a 5th season, but until then, you've been listening to Fletcher C. Johnson. I'm Fletcher C. Johnson. Thanks for listening.